In this session, we're going to take a look at the file permission inventory feature in EventSentry that's part of the security and compliance component. I'm here in the management console, and I already created a package called file permission, to which I added the permission inventory object, and I assigned that to the local EventSentry computer. Now, the permission inventory feature lets you, as the name implies, inventory all the permissions of a select folder or multiple folders, and then view those permissions in the EventSentry web reports. This then makes it a lot easier to manage and view all the permissions that you have on this folder and filter them on user, for example, on the type of permissions that are assigned and so forth. So instead of having to use the Windows Explorer to right-click folders and basically dig through various folders and right-click properties to view the permissions, you have a simple interface where you can filter on the server, the directory, the username, for example, and so forth. As you can see, there are not a whole lot of configuration options available for this feature, but we're going to go through them from the top to bottom. As you probably know, in the NTFS file system, every file and folder have to have permissions assigned to them. However, in most cases, permissions are just inherited from the parent folder. So if you have a directory, for example, with 1,000 files that all have the same permissions, then even though each file does have its individual set of ACEs, access control entries, that are part of an access control list, ACL, the permissions are in fact inherited from a parent folder. This makes it a little bit easier to manage these permissions, especially when you have a lot of nested folders and files, for example. Look in here, the program files. If the C program files directory has permissions that should apply to every subfolder and file, then you can just set them one time and choose for all subfolders and files to inherit the permissions from that folder. And that's where that first configuration option comes in. So by default, it's set to consolidate and omit inherited permissions. So what that means is if EventSentry detects that a file has the same permissions as the parent folder, essentially implying if it's inheriting permissions, then EventSentry will only record the permissions from the parent folder once and show those in our web reports instead of collecting permissions for every file. Because as you can imagine, if you're inventorying, let's say, a large number of files, let's say you have a file share with 1 million files, but they all have the same permissions, and there's no need to really consolidate and have an individual entry for each of those 1 million files. Instead, EventSentry will only collect the permissions that are different. So if there's a subfolder where the permissions deviate from the parent folder, then EventSentry will recognize that, will of course record those permissions, and so forth. So in most cases, you'll want to go with the first option, only record permissions if they have changed in subfolders. The second option, inventory all files and folders, is something you can do when you have a small folder with a few hundred or a few thousand files. In that case, if you for some reason really want to have the permissions stored in a database for every single file, then you can go with that option. So now here is where we specify the folders that we want to actually inventory. So EventSentry will of course not automatically inventory the entire C drive or all local drives. You'll have to specify the directories that you want to consolidate, that you want to inventory the permissions of. And of course, these folders will have to be specified local as the agent sees them. So you cannot specify file shares there. You'll have to specify the actual local directory, for example, program files. Then you can specify how often the permissions are refreshed, and that interval completely depends on how often you expect changes to occur in these file shares. By default, I believe it is 1 day, but you can also lower this interval if you want to have a more accurate display. And of course, this will also depend on how big the directories are that you're inventorying. So if you have a very large directory with millions of files, then you probably want to set that interval slightly higher, because it does take time to parse every single file in that directory and collect the permissions and send them to the collector and or write them to the database. In this case, the folders are fairly small, and for testing purposes, I set that interval to every hour, but in most cases, doing that once a day should be sufficient. And the last option, similar to all the other features, is which database are we writing this data to, and here we have the default primary database. Now let's take a look to see what this looks like in the web reports. I'm here on the permission status page that's under Features, Security, and Compliance. We only have one computer here. We have a number of folders, almost 300, And we have a total of 13 usernames that are essentially being used for these folders. If we expand this a little bit, we can see some of the folders that have custom permissions here. And we could just pick one here. Let's pick the Internet Explorer one here. We have 30 entries, so let's take a look at the details here. And here you can see all the permissions. So we have a couple of files here with different permissions. Here we can see the entries, the type of permissions, access allowed, and we can also see here for the folder, so there's no file name listed here, so these are folder permissions. We can see those here as well. You can either click on the file name here to see the permissions, or also click on this icon here. That brings up the actual permissions being used for this file. If you go back to the summary, I'm going to clear the folder here. Then we can also filter permissions here to only see permissions for this particular user. So for example, I can see here that we have the local service here. So now we can quickly see, okay, well, which custom permissions do I have in these folders where only the local service has access to. And here we can see a couple of EventSentry log folders here. And there's all folder permissions in the web reports and also in the Windows apps, for example. We can repeat this for a couple of the other ones as well. For example, we have the network service user, for example. Again, we can see Windows apps and something here in EventSentry. And finally, also of interest here is the power users user. And click that. We can see, okay, Dell System Management Tools, for some reason, the power users have access here. Let's take a look at the details here. Have read access to this file. Now, without a permission inventory system, it would be very difficult to find this unless you resort to PowerShell scripts and so forth. But you can see with this permission inventory feature, it's really easy to figure out, okay, who has access to which files, maybe clean up the permissions to keep your permissions cleaned up and secure.